Okay, of course, thank you, Mario, for the invitation, and also thank Donna, especially, and your staff for the assistance in everything. And apologies to Amara's mother. I don't have a tie, so you're authorized. I told you I needed yours. You're authorized not to take me seriously. I think we're shifting a bit towards the contemporary modern period, or actually a century we haven't really talked too much about, the 19th century, with my talk. So when thinking of an Italian Mediterranean, one cannot help conjuring up the mental image of the Roman Mare Nostrum, sang by Pascoli and D'Annunzio in support of Italian colonialism, translated by racial theorists into the idea of Italians as the Mediterranean race par excellence, and then enshrined at the symbolic center of the fascist imaginary. This imperium model of Mediterraneanness has certainly characterized the making of Italians from the early 20th century to our days. But things did not begin this way. Throughout the Risorgimento and for the first 40 years of national history, whether in political thought and action or literature and poetry, the Mediterranean Sea, along with its maritime cultures, its coastlines, ports, and economies of trade, was all but suppressed in the collective imaginary of Italians, for the most part either ignored or figured as an enemy, an obstacle, or a place of tragedy. In the minds and words of the agrarian elites that made the Risorgimento and led the unified nation into modernity, the Mediterranean was first of all associated with the ever-present threat of cholera epidemics that had reached the peninsula through its ports throughout the 19th century. Secondly, until the successful expedition of Garibaldi's Mille, its shores had marked the demise of all patriotic insurrections, such as the Bandiera Brothers expedition in 1844 and that of Pisacane's Trecento at Sapri in 1857. So much so that not even the epic Garibaldian expedition would bestow a maritime imaginary to the resurrected Italian nation. Despite his having been raised a sailor, having spent most of his military life as a captain of vessels, Garibaldi is remembered in Italy as a general. And in most paintings and in the dozens of monuments that immortalize him in Italian villages and cities, he's always represented on horse or standing, but never as a captain at sea. Thus, the Mediterranean was literally vacated from the image of the resurgent body of the Risorgimental nation. And right after unification, this absence would receive a key place in the making of Italians. Recent scholarship has begun reassessing the process of Italian unification from a post-colonial perspective in terms of a northern state occupation of a southern one, Piedmont and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, which foreshadowed the imperialist move of northern European nations on the entire African continent. I'm not seeking to abide by this expression, but it's part of a revival and reassessment of Italian unification. What I'm claiming is that little attention, even by this scholarship, has been given to how the criminalization of the South contributed to the insularization of the newly born nation. The discursive figuring of the South's resistance to Piedmontese or Italian occupation, however one wants to look at it, as brigantaggio, banditry, and mafia, which were both born as terms and exact specific definitions of the civil war that ensued after the occupation of the South, was accompanied by the transformation of scores of small Mediterranean islands all around the peninsula into prisons for those who opposed the resurgent Italian nation, from the Tremiti in Puglia to the Giglio in Tuscany, Lipari, Ustica, and Lampedusa in Sicily. Here, of course, Lampedusa will play a tremendous role, first as a prison for the insurrectional forces of the Italians, then as a fascist prison for Tunisians fighters, and then today, of course, as a different type of camp. But also Ponza in Ventotene in Lazio and Procida in Campania. In turn, this circle of prison islands reflected and implemented an imaginary of Mediterranean insecurity, an encirclement syndrome, as it was named by the political military establishment of the time, which happened to find traumatic confirmation in the disastrous defeat inflicted by the Austrian fleet to the Italian navy at the Battle of Lissa in 1866. While decades later, nationalist writers such as D'Annunzio would find poetic inspiration in the memory of Lissa to push Italians back towards the Mare Nostrum, at the time this defeat sustained a national suspicion towards the sea and the cultural suppression of the Mediterranean, even in the voices of southern authors. In fact, the most relevant and profound erasure of the Mediterranean from collective Italian consciousness is to be found in the very question that should have been posed in Mediterranean terms and was named instead La Questione Meridionale, the Southern question. Developed, as Nelson Moe has brilliantly illustrated, out of cultural material sedimented over the span of several centuries, the projection of a dichotomous Italy split between an industrializing and progressing north and a backward to atavistic south began to take shape in the mid-1870s to give a specific referent to the ill-defined process of making Italians. Quite simply and conveniently, from the 1870s onwards, to make Italians became a question of how to make Southerners into Northerners. In this respect, the discursive construction of the Southern question can be credited, as many have, with having nationalized a large sector of Southern elites. Beginning with Pasquale Villari's famous Lettere Meridionali, generations of Southern intellectuals have produced analysis and proposed solutions that, although diametrically opposed to the often racist overtones in which the question was posed by representatives of Northern elites, did not challenge the fundamental tenets of the question, and in particular, the polarization between an industrial North and an agricultural South. That Tuscan landowners, such as Leopoldo Franchetti and Sidney Sonnino, would not dedicate a single page of their famous Inchiesta in Sicilia of 1876 to the importance of the Mediterranean to the history, society, and cultural imagination of Sicilians is not entirely surprising. But it is rather shocking to remark the same absence in all of the major texts of Meridionalismo, from Villari's letters of 1875 to Napoleone Scolajanni's Settentrionali e Meridionali of 1889 to Giustino Sfortunato's Il Mezzogiorno e lo Stato Italiano of 1926, all the way to Antonio Gramsci's Note sulla questione meridionale of 1926 again. Even where, as in Francesco Nitti's Napoli e la questione meridionale, 1903, Naples' maritime history before 1860 is given some consideration, this is done in purely quantitative terms and only to conclude that Naples, and here I'm quoting Nitti, never played any important role in maritime commerce. Coming from the most strenuous critic of the Piedmontese state's exploitative treatment of the South, Nitti's lack of interest for the Mediterranean history of the Neapolitan kingdom is a strong indication that the unification processes and the making of Italians had come at the cost of a wholesale territorialization of the kingdom of the Two Sicilies into Italy's south, which first extracted the kingdom from its position of geographical center of the modern Mediterranean region, and then cut off even the newly born nation from its surrounding sea. An operation synthesized by the popular Turinist saying that Garibaldi, rather than united in Italy, had separated Africa. By the early 20th century, then all signs of a Neapolitan Mediterranean imaginary seem to have been definitively erased from the memory of even the staunchest champions of Meridionalismo. And yet, I'm here to argue that this imaginary had definitely existed for centuries. But it is not identifiable either with the supposed culture of honors and shame, nor the physical line of olives and grapes that defines the ecological frontiers of the Mediterranean region, both of which are anchored to the lands that surround the Middle Sea. At the level of the imaginary, Mediterranean-ness was ingrained in a myriad of economic and cultural practices that tied Naples to its islands, Ischia, Capri, and Procida, and through them to an ancient Mediterranean matrix that predated the imperium model of Roman Mare Nostrum and the first territorialization of the Italian South as Magna Graecia. Let's remember that that was a Roman term for the area. I'm referring to the Mediterranean of Emporia that began when the first bands of sailors coming from the island of Euboea crossed the Aegean in the late 8th century. And I'm cutting off, of course, the centuries and millennia of previous history of other islanders, to settle on the island of Ischia, and found there the first Greek emporium in the Greek West called Pitecuse. I'm inviting you to think about the fact that they sailed not, and they encountered on their path Sicily, Calabria, and many other places where they could have settled. So why did they settle first in Ischia, Pitecuse? Well, this was the reason is that they settled on this island because they were seeking contact with the Tyrrhenians, a population we call today Etruscans, but whose name was given by the sea that they were facing and that they were basically connected to, who had been the first and best to master the art of extracting and molding iron on the island of Elba, situated several miles north of Ischia. The Greeks settled a little south of there, but enough, close enough to Capua, Cerveteri, and Elba to be able to cut intermediaries and directly access iron and then refine it on the island of Ischia. And it was these Euboean Pithecusians at this point, this new construct of Euboean Pithecusians, islanders who later crossed the narrow strait of sea between Pithecusa and the continental coast to found the emporium of Cuma. And a few decades later, and a few miles to the south, the Euboean Pithecusians, Cumans, founded Parthenope, the ancient Naples. Viewed from the vantage point of the water they crossed, these Greek islanders and those who followed them inserted themselves in the middle section of the Mediterranean, thereby situating themselves as the go-betweens, connecting the Tyrrhenians to their north with the Phoenicians who dominated the southern shore of the sea. In the space of 2 centuries, the Greeks would make the southern coasts of the Italian peninsula and their islands the biogeographical center, I'm using Orden and Purcell's term, of an integrated Mediterranean Sea, connecting from north to south and east to west from the Black Sea to the Pillars of Hercules. Yet, this ancient Mediterranean was never a Greek lake, but a Mediterranean of Emporia, established by islanders who had projected their mentality onto the construction of a multicultural trading space that responded to the solicitations of a maritime matrix of identity. This matrix, and here I'm connecting to some of the things we talked about this morning with the excellent papers that preceded mine, this matrix established itself outside of and in contrast to the earthbound experience and definition of identity as rooted in land, language, traditions, and collective self-sameness. It operated in a space of oscillation rather than dialectic resolution, and it was predicated on the necessity and unpredictability of the encounter with another, which is not the same as the other. We can in fact liken the shape of this sea route of this ancient Mediterranean matrix to a fishnet, a crisscrossing of north, south, and west-east sea routes connecting dozens of emporia across the entire perimeter of the Mediterranean Sea. Like fishermen, all emporia were aware that those on all sides of the net needed to do their pulling, north, south, east, west, and each emporium needed to maintain maximum flexibility and openness to the solicitations coming from the others. Rather than fish, however, the Mediterranean net caught islands. Large or small, entangled like prey, Mediterranean islands played the vital role of tightening, soliciting, and activating the sea routes that traversed them. They were the shifting capitals of a blue continent without nations, where power was endemically liminal, for it rested literally at the continent's limes, boundaries, in the emporia that dotted its borders with the lands that surrounded it. As we all know, the original Mediterranean fishnet of emporia did not last further than the 3rd century before the Common Era, when Rome began to weave its spider web of imperium, which constituted the primary model of Mediterranean power and unity for all subsequent Thessalocracies. Yet, however long-lasting and dominant at the level of the political imagination it may have been, the imperium spiderweb model did not do away with the Emporian fishnet matrix of Mediterranean interaction. As Nicolas Purcell has succinctly put it, the ancient Mediterranean comprised all sorts of relations, including competition, mutual predation, parasitic violence, and subjugation, alongside cooperation and peaceful economic cooperation, which were later transfigured into tropes of Mediterranean integration, differing in their spatial configuration, scale, and genesis, but all relying on archipelagos and island chains for channeling their connectivity. From antiquity through the Middle Ages to modernity, to put it in Predrag's Matvejevic more poetic terms, the is a cultural landscape where the island is the model of the terra firma and the mainland acquires its island-like features. And in following Purcell and Matvejevic, we can safely identify in Venice, and if in following Purcell and Matvejevic, we can safely identify in Venice the quintessential fishnet state in the modern Mediterranean, still the Serenissima was neither the last fishnet weaver nor the more long-lasting. The last and most articulated reinvention and cultural transfiguration of the ancient Mediterranean matrix belonged to the Bourbon Kingdom of Naples. It seems to me fitting at this point to begin from another of Naples' Phlegraean islands, the small island of Procida, which was part of the Neapolitan territory since the 13th century, and with this unusual image of 2 marble busts positioned, I hope you can see them, and it's not going to be very clear, but I want to turn your attention. These are 2 marble busts positioned in a lunette over the doorway at number 11 of Salita San Leonardo in Procida. One bust depicts the face of a woman. The other one is more surprising. It is a double-faced bust depicting 2 youth with very similar North African features, but one with darker, grayer skin than the other. And that's the one in the back. Unfortunately, we can't see it very well. I apologize. My ability as a photographer is very poor. And I didn't want to move the statues when I found them. My archival research has uncovered that the 2 statues were made during the Bourbon reign, but I have not been able to establish either the exact date of their making, nor who commissioned them, or their maker. Thankfully, oral tradition has stepped in to make the tale of these 2 busts much more revealing than any documentation could. The 2 statues are said to commemorate an event that refers to the times quando l'isola era caduta in mano ai Mori, when the island was in the hands of the Moors, the Saracens, possibly somewhere between 900 and 1200 of the Common Era. The Saracens' caliph, il califfo, was looking to replenishing his harem with local women. During this selection process, the pre-adolescent son of one of these women began playing with the only son of the caliph, who had been greatly afflicted by his mother's death. Suddenly, the youth had erupted into laughter, and the caliph, overjoyed by the event, had decided to grant the beautiful Prochidan mother her request not to enter his harem, but rather to let her son live at court and allow her to serve as governess to both children. As times went by, the 2 youth grew together like brothers until the day that le navi dei Bourboni, Bourbon warships, appeared suddenly at the horizon, and the Saracens scrambled to leave the island at once. In the rush, however, they mistook the noble Procident sons for the caliph's son and heir, and left the island with the one and not the other. Years passed during which the Procident woman mourned the loss of her child, but hid the true identity of her adopted son, and Procident fishermen kept pushing their boats further and further into the Mediterranean in search of contact with Saracen's boat. At last, one day, a più di 40 miglia a sud di Procida, more than 40 miles south of Procida, Procident sailors made contact with Moorish traders and arranged for an exchange of the two youth, which took place soon after. The two busts were then commissioned, the tradition says, by the Procident youth, ora diciottenne, now 18 years old, who had returned to his mother covered in gold by the Caliph. This is the story that is being told. This is the story that I have also recaptured by the men who actually took the statues from the one of the churches of the island and transferred them in this location. There is much in this tale that would merit close scrutiny and commentary, and I apologize but we can go into it afterwards. But I'd like to turn your attention only to the purposeful anachronism of putting Mori, that is 10th through the 13th century Saracens or Muslim pirates or slave traders, on the same temporal plane of 18th and 19th century Bourbons. Since the story commemorates a late medieval event, fictional or real, the Christians reconquering the island would have been Byzantines or Swabians or even Angevins, but surely not Bourbons. The fact that the Bourbons are always referred to as those recapturing the island may be safely attributed to an oral tradition that tends to elide differences between 10th and 12th century Saracens or Moors and 16th to 19th century Ottomans or Turks. But even if that were so, this sliding speaks to the persistent perception of cultural continuity beneath the fragmented political history of the Kingdom of Naples. And most importantly, this perception is clearly not just a contemporary phenomenon. For if the story told today collapses Mori and Bourboni, the two busts were indeed carved during the Bourbon kingdom. And if we cannot establish what exactly was the original story attached to the two busts, still we can be sure that someone on this island during the Bourbon kingdom took the time and the money to commission two statues, one of which represented two faces with North African features. The original story may have differed in the details, but I don't think it could have been too fundamentally different. In other words, it must have commemorated and celebrated in Bourbon times a long-lasting fishnet of contacts, exchange, and friendship between Procidents and Arabs, Christians and Muslims. What's more, traces of this continuity are inscribed in the very architectural and cultural fabric of the island, beginning with the uniquely rich Procident costume, worn by Procident women in the 18th and 19th centuries, but that probably went back many centuries earlier. And I'm pointing out to the image on the left. This one on your left is actually a portrait of a Procident woman in the Palazzo Reale of Naples, ordered by the Bourbons, because this was so unique, the Procident costume, so rich and so unusual that women would wear these very rich costumes. But what is most important is that this had married completely the Procident costume, which was vest, scarf, headscarf, and gold embroidery mixed Turkish and North African motifs. I could show you many more pictures of the embroidery, and which is still done in pure gold. Now, and not to speak of the harbor of the Corricella, the beautiful land, so-called. Some of you have probably seen it in the famous movie Il Postino. One of the three harbors communities of the island, which not only married Arab architectural elements, such as the doming roof to collect water, to innovative archways to form a uniquely collective conglomerate of spontaneous architecture. Still today, this is a unique case of collective architecture, but was also built, and this is even more unique, according to naval rather than civil engineering practices. Most significantly, this unique port was developed as a maritime community of fishermen and traders in the 16th century, at the height of the military strife between Spanish and Ottoman Empire, when the island was the target of numerous corsairs' attacks and even occupations. Rather than fearing assault or barricading itself with the Corricella, Procida seemed to announce to anyone appearing at the horizon, "We are open for business." It should not be surprising then to find that the Bourbons created in Procida one of the principal dockyard and shipyard of the kingdom. By mid-19th century, Procidan ship owners and builders owned 702 between Tartans and Brigantines. Modern Procida, therefore, came to play a role akin to that of Ischia Pitecuse in antiquity to sustain the formation of a new fishnet that extended through a mixture of state policies and private initiatives to all sectors of the kingdom's life. In the remainder of my time, I would like to focus on two of these aspects. Unquestionably, the most evident signs of Naples' allegiance to the emporium matrix of Mediterranean-ness can be found in the spectacular expansion of maritime commerce under the Bourbons. This, however, is not a story of unmitigated success, if measured, as Nitti did, against its northern European rivals and according to the criteria they imposed on the science of economics. Despite its central geographical position in the Mediterranean, Naples never measured up to the expectations of its observers. Its centrality, so to speak, was peripheral and parasitical to the dominant intercontinentalization of trade in the Mediterranean. For example, although third in terms of tonnage potential, overall, Neapolitan maritime commerce remained a fraction of the British and French volume in the Mediterranean. And according to Biagio Salvemini, the sea routes of the Neapolitan fleet failed to intersect those of intercontinental trade. And yet, one needs to read this story of failure against the grain of a Mediterranean vocation inscribed in the patterns of Neapolitan sea trade. As Salvemini defines them, these patterns presented traditional Mediterranean features such as the privileging of exchange over production and the reliance of an integration of internal microregions to ports that took into account the ability of peasants to turn into sailors in periods of agricultural stasis, and especially of sailors and ship captains to act as merchants themselves, taking advantage of the endemic volatility of supply and demand in the Mediterranean. This way, Naples constructed its geographical commercial centrality by focusing on traditional cabotage, thereby disrupting the attempt by intercontinental trade to control the ebbs and flows and the rhythms of internal Mediterranean cabotage, and becoming the nodal point of passage for trade between Marseille, Alexandria, and Odessa, which were the ports then connected to the intercontinental trade. The persistence of this emporium matrix in Bourbon times Naples may have thus condemned the kingdom to miss the train of industrial production and be perceived as a colony of Northern Europe. But it also allowed it to reverse its imbalance of trade with France and proved more flexible and adept to specifically Mediterranean conditions of exchange than the almighty British commercial fleet. Let's not forget that the Kingdom of Naples at the time of unification was the third richest nation in Europe. Read in reverse, the Neapolitan fleet's propensity for a commerce of small to medium cabotage and an economy of adaptability, risk-taking and exchange, rather than production, added value and maximization of profits, may have guaranteed a marginal breathing space for the survival of a 2,000 years old matrix of Mediterranean-ness that, however elusive, percolated in all areas of Neapolitan life. As Paolo Macri has argued, the most famous financial institution of Naples, the Lotto, the lottery, cannot be understood in isolation from the economy of circulation that characterized Naples as a universal emporium for the 8 million inhabitants of the kingdom. For Macri, the thousands of servants, around 15,000, public employees, around 20,000, and street vendors, along with the tertiary vocation of the Neapolitan entrepreneurial class, but also the innumerable mediators of administrative services who turned rights into privileges by facilitating any sort of dealing with the authorities. We call that corruption today, of course, and with some reasons. They all the way to the Camorra's control, the organized crime control over the food market, were part of a gigantic and purely understood redistribution economy that guaranteed and maintained continuity between maritime trade, commercial speculation, property renting, and financial speculation, and thus tied Neapolitan maritime commerce to the agricultural hinterland of the kingdom. In fact, I'd like to conclude with a highly symbolic episode that reveals how the Mediterranean-ness that permeated Neapolitan culture and commercial models extended fully to the political imaginary of the court itself. What you're seeing here is a picture from a book, which is the transcription of a talk given by a mineralogist, Carlo Lippi, presenting at the Royal Academy of Science in Naples a project for the conjunction of the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian Seas through a network of subterranean tunnels and canals connected to the Lake Fucino and the many small rivers and creeks that traverse the region extended between Pescara and Terracina. So the project was to start from here, pass through a lake that is now being prosciugated, dried up, and end up here. This was presented on February 25th, 1820. But the project had been in the works from the 1780s, when major projects in the Ottoman Empire for the construction in Egypt, not of the Suez Canal, but of other canals, had attracted the attention. If we want to really think about the fundamental sort of sign of modernity in the 19th century, which ends with the Tour Eiffel and the verticality of the Tour Eiffel, that is the canal. The canal is the engineering feat, the connectivity, the Canal du Midi, the canals in North America. All of the canals of the 19th century might represent some of the most important sense, and that's where I think Mediterranean really plays a role. The idea was to utilize the waters of the lake to fill up the artificial canals in order to create, in Lippi's words, a 120 miles long waterway that transformed the whole kingdom into an island and connected all of its seas. In detailing the economic advantages of the plan, Lippi put at the top of the list the speed with which the kingdom could have received and distributed the enormous quantity of iron, steel, lead, and copper that was necessary to its industrialization. And right after, he mentioned the possibility of utilizing this unique waterway for the establishment of mills and foundries of all kinds. But these economic gains paled in comparison with the symbolic return the kingdom was to receive from the operation. For Lippi, with the Fucino Canal, the kingdom of the Two Sicilies would have given physical reality to its uncanny name by creating a second artificial island out of the entire southern region of the peninsula. Italy would have thus truly ended at the Fucino rather than ending figuratively at the Garigliano. And the kingdom of the Two Sicilies would have unequivocally signaled its Mediterranean vocation, making physically clear its disdain for providing tip and heel to the naturalizing image of the Italian boot. What's more, it came very, very close to doing so. Lippi's presentation was attended by the powerful superintendent to the bridges, streets, waters, forests, and game in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Carlo Alfan de Rivera, who lent his support to Lippi, but with a key variant. No subterranean tunnels. The whole 120 miles had to be made navigable in order to constitute the kingdom's fourth sea. and thereby separated entirely from the rest of the peninsula. Work began in 1825, but slowed down due to unforeseen engineering problems. Construction resumed in 1838, but again proceeded very slowly, so that when the Risorgimento came and swept away the Kingdom of Naples, the project was killed along with the Mediterranean imaginary that fueled the dream of an industrialized island state at the center of the Mediterranean world. Thank you.